Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Knight c3 to b5. Knight d7 to b6. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight b5 to a3. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight a3 to c2. Castle kingside. Bishop f1 to e2. Bishop c8 to d7. Castle kingside. Pawn f7 to f6. Bishop e2 to d3. Pawn f6 takes e5. Pawn d4 takes e5. Rook f8 to f4. Knight c2 to e3. Pawn d5 to d4. Queen d1 to b3. Queen e7 to d8. Knight e3 to c4. Knight b6 takes c4. Bishop d3 takes c4. Rook f4 takes f3. Pawn g2 takes f3. Queen d8 to g5, check. King g1 to h1. Queen g5 to f5. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight c6 takes d4. Queen b3 to d3. Queen f5 to h5. Rook f1 to g1. Bishop d7 to c6. Rook g1 to g3. Rook a8 to f8. King h1 to g1. Knight d4 takes f3, check. Rook g3 takes f3. Bishop c6 takes f3. Bishop c4 takes e6, check. King g8 to h8. Pawn h2 to h3. Queen h5 to g5, check. Bishop e6 to g4. Pawn h7 to h5. Queen d3 to e3. Queen g5 takes e3. Pawn f2 takes e3. Pawn h5 takes g4. Pawn h3 takes g4. Rook f8 to e8. King g1 to f2. Bishop f3 to d5. Rook a1 to c1. Pawn c5 to c4. Pawn e3 to e4. Bishop d5 takes e4. King f2 to e3. Rook e8 takes e5. King e3 to f4. Rook e5 to e7. Rook c1 takes c4. Bishop e4 to c6. Rook c4 to c2. Rook e7 to e4, check. King f4 to g5. Rook e4 to e5, check. King g5 to f4. Rook e5 to e4, check. King f4 to g5. Rook e4 to e5, check. King g5 to f4. Rook e5 to a5. Rook c2 to h2, check. King h8 to g8. Pawn b2 to b3. Pawn g7 to g5, check. King f4 to g3. Rook a5 to d5. Rook h2 to c2. Bishop c6 to d7. King g3 to f3. Rook d5 to d4. King f3 to e3. Rook d4 takes g4. Rook c2 to c7. Bishop d7 to c6. King e3 to d3. Rook g4 to f4. Rook c7 to c8, check. King g8 to f7. King d3 to e3. Rook f4 to f3, check. King e3 to d4. Pawn g5 to g4. Rook c8 to c7, check. King f7 to f8. Rook c7 to c8, check. King f8 to g7. Rook c8 to c7, check. Rook f3 to f7. Rook c7 takes f7, check. King g7 takes f7. King d4 to d3. Bishop c6 to d5. King d3 to e2. Pawn a6 to a5. King e2 to f2. Bishop d5 takes b3. Pawn a2 takes b3. King f7 to e6. King f2 to g3. King e6 to f5. King g3 to g2. King f5 to f4. King g2 to f1. King f4 to f3. King f1 to e1. Pawn g4 to g3. King e1 to d1. Pawn g3 to g2. King d1 to d2. Pawn g2 to g1, promoting to queen. King d2 to c2. King f3 to e3. Pawn b3 to b4. Queen g1 to h2, check. King c2 to b3. Pawn a5 to a4, check. King b3 takes a4. Queen h2 to a2, check. King a4 to b5. Queen a2 to a6, check. King b5 to c5. Queen a6 to c6, checkmate.